So the way that we can basically fix that is to have a method here, which we're going to refactor later. So let's for now just call it private. We're going to refactor it later. So don't worry about that for now. So what this method is going to do is to get our credentials. Okay, and the credentials are basically going to be the connection credentials. So let's pass it a string and say the type of connection. So TYP. And then basically we need to say that this is a function. So private function get credentials using a specific key. And then we can do an array merge. So we can say return array merge. And array merge, as you should know, is basically a PHP function that we can use to combine two arrays together. And why do we care about this in this method? Because we want to use a test database for testing purposes. We don't want to basically use the same database for test and the same database for our application. So we're going to have two databases. One will be for test and the second one is going to be for our actual application. So when we get the connection credentials from the database, we want to override the database name. Okay, so we can do that easily using array merge. So we can then come again to database and then we want to copy the database name. So this is what we want to override. And then inside of this array, paste it here. And then we're going to add test to this. Testing. Okay, so this is going to be the database that we're going to create for our testing purposes. And now here we can replace this with the array. So we can say this get credentials and then pass it the key because we only have one credential there, so which is PDO. We're going to pass it PDO and then we're going to trigger the test again. Everything works as expected. And of course, you know that we are actually not implementing the connect method yet to connect to a specific database. So that's what we are going to basically be doing next. Okay. And let's see if we can actually improve one of the tests before we continue. So remember right here, we are saying the connect method should not be null. Well, a better way for us to do that is to really just see if whatever we get here implements the connection interface. So we're going to say instance of. So remember that we used this in our previous test. So we want to right here now say this is instance of connection interface. So we're going to say database connection interface and then the handler, which is going to be a PDO handler. And let's run that test again. Okay, so it passes. And then now we can have other methods to actually see if we can get a connection. So that could now be based on the output that we get from this test. So we can create a different test that depends on this test, and that will now return us an actual PDO connection. So let's write a test for that. So public function test, it is a valid PDO connection. So basically this is going to take one argument, okay? And the argument that this is going to take is going to be this interface. So database connection interface, and it's going to be a connection. And what we can do is to basically return this from this method. So we can say return the PDO handler. So we're returning the PDO handler, which is basically this class, and this class should have a method which is called get connection. Okay, so we can basically just name this properly. Let's say handler, and then let's write this properly. So in PHPUnit, there is a way that we can actually pass value from one test to a different test, okay? And the way that we can do that is to put an annotation here. So we can say that this test depends on a previous test. So what we want to do here is to say that this test depends on a previous one, so we can use the @ sign, @depends, and then we can specify the test that it depends on. That will be test. It can connect to database with PDO. Okay, so when that happens, it means that it is expecting a value from this test, which is going to be the PDO connection, which is an instance or which actually implements the connection interface. And then here we can say assert, let's say save assert instance of, okay. Now we want to say PDO class. You know, the PDO have its own class. So we can say that the handler that we're getting is an instance of the PDO class. So that will be handler get connection, basically. Okay, so we can then say get connection. All right, so remember that basically in our interface, we have two methods, connect and get connection. Okay, so get connection here should be a PDO connection if we are using a PDO class. Okay, so we expect that when we connect to a PDO database, we expect a PDO connection, and which is what we're basically testing here. So as you know, this is going to fail because we have not implemented a connection to the database, and we also don't have a way to actually get the PDO connection yet. So let's come back and say inside of this PDO class, let's just say here, return this connection. Okay, let's say return this connection, and then we can run the test now. Right, let's trigger the test, and then it fails. Fails asserting that no is an instance of PDO. All right, so let's fix this. So to fix this, we need to actually connect to the database, and then we set the connection, and then we can actually get the connection in subsequent places. All right, so let's go back again now to our PDO connection class, and then implement the connect method. Okay, so this is what we want to now implement, this method called connect. So let's get back again to a diagram before we actually continue. So we have here this method called pass credential. So it's not an abstract method in the abstract connection. We could actually make it to be that, but I didn't want to actually enforce that because it's really has nothing to do with the connection itself, but it's just the way that we would like to write code more cleaner. So if we want to ensure that all our connection classes actually have this method, we can make it an abstract class, but it's not really compulsory that we do that. So let's fix that. So come here and then add an abstract class. So abstract public function, or we can make it protected. So let's make it protected. Pass credentials. And this is basically going to accept an array of credentials, and it's going to return an array. Okay, so abstract classes do not have a body, so that's my bad. And then here inside of the implementation, we should now have an error here saying that we need to implement that abstract method. Okay, so we have it here, protected function pass credential. And then here we are now going to define how we want to basically pass the credential for PDO. So for PDO, it requires a DSN, which is essentially the data source name, and it contains the driver, the host name, and the name of the database that you want to connect to. So we can use printf to make it a bit cleaner. And then here we can specify some placeholders and the way that we want to prepare the string. So %s, this is going to be for the driver that we're using, which can be MySQL, it can be Postgres, it can be anything that you want to use. And then host, then an equal sign, and then %s. So this is going to be host, which is essentially when we are developing on localhost, this will be equal to localhost. And if you look at our credentials in the config database.php file, you would essentially see that it is localhost there. And then the next one is db name. So that will be db name. So that should be equal to %s. So we need to pass in three things to the printf function to create a connection string for us. So the first thing that we need to pass through will be the driver. So we can say credentials and then target the driver key. So at this point, we already know that our credentials have all the required keys because we have a test for that, and our code is basically telling us that that is fine. So we're going to basically say host here, and then the third one should be the DB name. And then right here, we can now just return an array. So we can say return an array which contains the DSN, which is a string, the connection string, and then it contains the username. Okay, so I'm going to explain something to you that's really important here, which basically deals with how we want to connect. So DB underscore username, and then DB underscore password, which will be the last one. So let's just grab it from the file here, password, user password. Okay, so let's paste it here. And that's all we need to do here. So the important thing here that I want you to take note of is we need to return the credential in the same order that the PDO class will be expecting to get the credential. So if we want to connect to the database using PDO, so let's come here, and I would just illustrate that as we write on. So let's say credentials. This is equal to this pass credentials, okay? Pass credentials, and we are going to here say these credentials, okay? And then right here, we're going to say try, okay? So still trying to explain why we are basically arranging the credentials the way that I did there. So let's say exception, and then right here. So I'm going to bring this up here and say use PDO exception, PDO exception, and then also use PDO class, okay? And then we can come down here again. So what we can now do is to say this connection is equal to new PDO. So when you want to connect to the database using PDO, okay, let's come to the declaration here. So it accepts a DSN, a username, password, and options, okay? So in our case here, we are just going to pass in the DSN, the username, and the password in this order. DSN first, the username, and then the password. And the reason why I had to make this method return the argument in this order is because we're going to be using the spread operator. So what that means is that I can here say dot, 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 and then pass in the credentials, which is basically an array. So what PHP does is it's going to now look inside of this array, okay? Depending on the number of items, elements that I have inside of this array, it will just convert them to variable in the same way that PDO is expecting us to pass in the DSN, the username, and the password. So now we have 3 elements here. So it's just going to create variables like this, okay? So the first variable will be DSN, the second one will be the username, and then the third one will be the password, and then just pass it into the PDO connection. All right, so that works as expected. A few things that we may want to still do here will be to essentially determine how PDO should handle exceptions when exception occurs. So remember, we are still trying to make our test pass, and what we have done so far, the test is not really going to pass, but let's just run it and see. So the test will not pass because we don't have the database. Let's run it and then see what happens. It can connect to the database. Only array and transversable can be unpacked. So this is actually an error. Let's see why we're having that error. Let's get back again to the test editor. So we know that this error is basically coming from where we are getting the, okay, so we're using the wrong method here. So this should be basically pass connection. So pass credentials, sorry. Then let's run the test again. Okay, so now we get different errors. Okay, so the first thing it says it's connected to database with PDO, all right? And then we get another error here, which is the same that we've been getting before, because the instance is really not PDO. But this can be really misleading. Here it says it can connect to database with PDO. Is it a valid PDO connection? No. And the reason is because PDO is basically not throwing exception. There was actually an error that happened, but the default mode for PDO is error mode silent, which is why it's basically did not throw any exception here. So what we can now do is to change the error reporting level for PDO. So we can say this connection, and then we want to basically set the error reporting level. So we can say set attribute, and then the attribute that we want to set will be PDO column, and then we want to say attribute error mode. So that will be ATTR underscore error mode, and then the value should be error mode exception. So we're going to say error mode exception. And then we can also set the fetch method for PDO. We could also do that in one line, but let's just make it different. So let's say this connection, set the attribute, and the attribute we want to set this time will be PDO, the fetch method. So we should start with attribute, it will be ATT attribute underscore fetch. So this should be double. All right, so that should be the fetch method. So it should be default fetch mode. And then that could now be PDO, or really we can get it from this credential. So we can say this credentials, and then we want to get the fetch method from the credential. Remember that we have a fetch method defined in the credentials. So let's come here, and then we have the default fetch. Then put it here. So a better way would be basically for us to make this dynamic in case you want to change this. So we could provide a method and a property to allow changing this method, but we're going to leave it like this for now. And then basically we can spread this to new lines. And then inside of here, what we can now do is to undo that exception. So we're going to say true, new, database connection exception, and then we want to get the message, and then maybe we also want to pass in the credentials depending on how we want to do that. So we can say this credentials, and then we can set the code to 500. So let's try to run the test again. Okay, so this time you see now that the test does not pass. Okay, it can connect to the database. The test is failing. No connection could be made because the target machine actively refused it. So it means that I don't even have my database running. So what I can do is to basically just start my database. So I'm going to start Apache and then start MySQL database, and then we can run the test again. This time we should get a proper error message, unknown database, bug app testing. So I'm going to create this database now. So copy that, come over here, and then I'm going to create that database. So I'm going to say local, and, essentially it should be db.local, and then I'm going to connect. Then I'm going to say I need a new database, and then paste it here. I'm going to create another one called bug app, which is going to be for the main application. So let's say new. Let's bug app. So we have two new databases. One is for testing and one will be for the main application. So let us now run the test again, and everything passes as we would expect. So now we know that we have a database connection that is really reliable because we've tested everything, all the possible scenarios, and we have test cases for each of the things that may fail. So let's come back again to the application and just fine tune a few things. So right here, we're going to say we expect PDO connection. Okay, and then that will be all we need to do here. Let's come back again to the test, and you can see that everything really passes as we are expecting it to. So let's trigger it again to be 100% sure it passes.